The fourth pillar of self-esteem is the practice of self-assertiveness. Self-assertiveness means honoring my wants, needs, and values and seeking appropriate forms of their expression in reality. Its opposite is that surrender to timidity that consists of consigning myself to a perpetual underground where everything that I am lies hidden or stillborn, to avoid confrontation with someone whose values differ from mine, or to please, placate, or manipulate someone, or simply to belong. Self-assertion does not mean belligerence or inappropriate aggressiveness. It does not mean pushing to the front of the line or knocking other people over. It does not mean upholding my own rights while being blind or indifferent to everyone else's. It simply means the willingness to stand up for myself, to be who I am openly, to treat myself with respect in all human encounters. To practice self-assertiveness is to live authentically, to speak and act from my innermost convictions and feelings, as a way of life, as a rule, allowing for the obvious fact that there may be particular circumstances in which I may justifiably choose not to do so. Appropriate self-assertiveness pays attention to context. The forms of self-expression appropriate when playing on the floor with a child are obviously different from those appropriate at a staff meeting. In every context, there will be appropriate and inappropriate forms of self-expression. Sometimes, self-assertiveness is manifested through volunteering an idea or paying a compliment. Sometimes, through a polite silence that signals non-agreement. Sometimes, by refusing to smile at a tasteless joke. While appropriate self-expression varies with the context, in every situation there is a choice between being authentic or inauthentic, real or unreal. If we do not want to face this, of course, we will deny that we have such a choice. We will assert that we are helpless. But the choice is always there. Let's examine what self-assertiveness is and is not. The first and basic act of self-assertion is the assertion of consciousness. This entails the choice to see, to think, to be aware, to send the light of consciousness outward toward the world, and inward toward our own being. To ask questions is an act of self-assertion. To challenge authority is an act of self-assertion. To think for oneself and to stand by what one thinks is the root of self-assertion. To default on this responsibility is to default on the self at the most basic level. Note that self-assertiveness should not be confused with mindless rebelliousness. Sometimes people who are essentially dependent and fearful choose a form of assertiveness that is self-destructive. It consists of reflexively saying no when their interest would be better served by saying yes. Their only form of self-assertiveness is protest, whether it makes sense or not. We often see this response among teenagers and among adults who have never matured beyond this teenage level of consciousness. While healthy self-assertiveness requires the ability to say no, it is ultimately tested not by what we are against, but by what we are for. A life that consists only of a string of negations is a waste and a tragedy. Self-assertiveness asks that we not only oppose what we deplore, but that we live and express our values. To practice self-assertiveness logically and consistently is to be committed to my right to exist. This proceeds from the knowledge that my life does not belong to others, and that I am not here on earth to live up to someone else's expectations. To many people, this is a terrifying responsibility. It means that mother and father and other authority figures cannot be counted on as protectors. It means they are responsible for their own existence and for generating their own sense of security. To practice self-assertiveness consistently, I need the conviction that my ideas and wants are important. Unfortunately, this conviction is often lacking. When we were young, many of us received signals conveying that what we thought and felt or wanted was not important. It often takes courage to honor what we want and to fight for it. For many people, self-surrender and self-sacrifice are far easier. They do not require the integrity and responsibility that intelligent selfishness requires. Within an organization, Self-assertiveness is required not merely to have a good idea, but to develop it, fight for it, work to win supporters for it, do everything within one's power to see that it gets translated into reality. It is the lack of this practice that causes so many potential contributions to die before they are born. As a consultant, when I am asked to work with a team that has difficulty functioning effectively on some project, I often find that one source of the dysfunction is one or more people who do not really participate in the undertaking. Why? Because of some feeling that they do not have the power to make a difference. They do not believe that their contribution can matter. In their passivity, they become saboteurs. A project manager once remarked to me, "I'd rather worry about handling some egomaniac who thinks he's the whole project than struggle with some self-doubting but talented individual whose insecurities stop him from kicking in what he's got to offer." Without appropriate self-assertiveness, we are spectators, not participants. Healthy self-esteem asks that we leap into the arena, that we be willing to get our hands dirty. Persons with an underdeveloped sense of identity often tell themselves, "If I express myself, I may evoke disapproval. If I love and affirm myself, I may evoke resentment. If I am too happy with myself, I may evoke jealousy. If I stand out, I may be compelled to stand alone." Such people remain frozen in the face of such possibilities and pay a terrible price in loss of self-esteem. Self-assertion entails the willingness to confront rather than evade the challenges of life and to strive for mastery. When we expand the boundaries of our ability to cope, we expand self-efficacy and self-respect. When we commit ourselves to new areas of learning, when we take on tasks that stretch us, we raise personal power. We assert our existence. When we are attempting to understand something and we hit a wall, it is an act of self-assertiveness to persevere. When we undertake to acquire new skills, absorb new knowledge, extend the reach of our mind across unfamiliar spaces, we are practicing self-assertiveness. When we learn how to be in an intimate relationship without abandoning our sense of self, when we learn how to be kind without being self-sacrificing, when we learn how to cooperate with others without betraying our standards and convictions, then we are practicing self-assertiveness. Some people stand and move as if they have no right to the space they occupy. Some speak as if their intention is that you not be able to hear them, either because they mumble or speak faintly or both. Some signal at the most crudely obvious level that they do not feel they have a right to exist. These people embody lack of self-assertiveness in its most extreme form. Their poor self-esteem is obvious. In therapy, when such men and women learn to move and speak with more assurance, they invariably report a rise in self-esteem. Not all manifestations of non-self-assertiveness are obvious. The average life is marked by thousands of unremembered silences, surrenders, capitulations, and misrepresentations of feelings and beliefs that corrode dignity and self-respect. When we do not express ourselves, do not assert our being, do not stand up for our values in contexts where it is appropriate to do so, we inflict wounds on our sense of self. The world does not do it to us. We do it to ourselves. Consider as an example a young man who sits alone in the darkness of a movie theater, deeply inspired by the drama unfolding before him. The story touches him so deeply that tears come to his eyes. He knows that in a week or so he will come back and want to see this film again. In the lobby, he spots a friend who was at the same screening, and they greet each other. He searches his friend's face for clues to his feelings about the movie, but the face is blank. The friend inquires, "How'd you like the picture?" The young man feels an instant stab of fear. He does not want to appear uncool. He does not want to say the truth. "I loved it. It touched me very deeply." So instead, he shrugs indifferently and says, "Not bad." He does not know that he has just slapped his own face, or rather he does not know it consciously. His diminished self-esteem knows it. A woman is at a cocktail party where she hears someone make an ugly racial slur that causes her inwardly to cringe. She wants to say, "I found that offensive," but she is afraid of evoking disapproval. In embarrassment, she looks away and says nothing. Later, to appease her sense of uneasiness, she tells herself, "What difference does it make? The man was a fool." But her self-esteem knows what difference it makes. Now, a personal example. I have already mentioned the relationship that I began with Ayn Rand a month before my 20th birthday, and that came to an explosive parting of the ways 18 years later. Among the many benefits that I received from her in the early years, one was an experience of profound visibility. I felt understood and appreciated by her to an extent that was without precedent. What made her response so important was the high esteem in which I held her. I admired her enormously. Only gradually did I realize that she did not tolerate disagreement well, not among intimates. She did not require full agreement among acquaintances, but with anyone who wanted to be truly close, enormous enthusiasm was expected for her every deed and utterance. I did not notice the steps by which I learned to censor negative reactions to some of her behavior. When, for example, I found her self-congratulatory remarks excessive, or her lack of empathy disquieting, or her pontificating unworthy of her. I did not give her the kind of corrective feedback everyone needs from time to time. In later years, after the break, I often reflected on why I did not speak up more often. The simple truth was, I valued her esteem too much to place it in jeopardy. I had, in effect, become addicted to it. In exchange for the intoxicating gratification of being treated as a demigod by the person I valued above all others, and whose good opinion I treasured above all others, I leashed my self-assertiveness in ways that over time were damaging to my self-regard. In the end, I learned an invaluable lesson. I learned that surrenders of this kind do not work. They merely postpone confrontations that are inevitable and necessary. I learned that the temptation to self-betrayal can sometimes be worst with those about whom we care the most, and I learned that no amount of admiration for another human being can justify sacrificing one's judgment. The following sentence stems can facilitate reaching a deeper understanding of self-assertiveness. Each morning, for each stem, write 6 to 10 endings as rapidly as possible. Self-assertiveness to me means, if I lived 5% more self-assertively today, if I brought more awareness to my deepest needs and wants, if I were willing to voice my thoughts and opinions more often, when I suppressed my thoughts and opinions, and, as before, on the weekend, after reading the week's stems, write 6 to 10 endings for this one. If any of what I have been writing this week is true, it might be helpful if I... Once again, we can appreciate that the actions that support healthy self-esteem are also expressions of healthy self-esteem. Self-assertiveness both supports self-esteem and is a manifestation of it. It is a mistake to look at someone who is self-assured and say, well, it's easy for her to be self-assertive. She has good self-esteem. One of the ways we build self-esteem is by being self-assertive when it is not easy to do so. There are always times when self-assertiveness calls on our courage.